I first read his book, American Born Chinese, when it came out years ago. We'll talk about that. But I felt like I really met Gene in the year 1900 about. And I know we don't look that old. The reason is because he did Boxers and Saints about the Boxer Rebellion. And it's a two-book set. And if you haven't read it, get it. It's tremendous. And I just feel like Gene, what we see with each one of his works is he's just growing deeper. His superpowers as a writer, a storyteller, artist just grow and grow. And what we're going to talk about a lot today is the Shadow Hero, and we'll get into the history of that. But when I met Gene, he was a one-time National Book Award finalist. Now he's a two-time National Book Award finalist. And what you will see with him, I'm sure, by the time he's gonna win that thing. And I expect in the future Pulitzer, maybe an Emmy. You know what you're going to see is the beginning of a tremendous career. So we're very lucky to have him. Please welcome Gene Luen Yang.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for coming out. It's a pleasure to be here. This is an amazing book festival. What I want to do is I'm gonna do a very short presentation about two pieces of my identity. I'm an Asian American cartoonist, so I want to talk about how those two pieces interact. And then after that, I'm gonna sit down with Michael and we're gonna have a short conversation. So just to tell you a little bit more about myself, I am a cartoonist. I've been doing this for almost 20 years now. Here are some of the comics and graphic novels that I've done during those past 20 years. About 3 years ago, I got involved with these books right here. Now, how many of you have ever seen the show called Avatar: The Last Airbender? Have you seen this? If you did not raise your hand, you should feel a little bit ashamed because this is an amazing show. It ran on Nickelodeon from 2005 to 2008. Nickelodeon asked a comic book company called Dark Horse Comics to create a series of graphic novels that would continue the story after the end of the show. So in these graphic novels, we show you what happens to Aang and his friends as they get older. If you watch the show, you know who I'm talking about. I was asked to write these by one of the editors at Dark Horse who was familiar with my work. It's been an amazing experience. I feel like I've learned so much. The best part of working on these books is that I get to call Mike DiMartino and Brian Konietzko, the creators of the show, and they call me back. It's awesome. So this middle book right here, all three of these books are out now. The middle book tells you what happens to Zuko's mom. Avatar fans will know what I'm talking about there too. And we have another volume coming out in September that I'm very excited about called Smoke and Shadow. Now my next book to come out of my own, where I made up and own the characters, is called Secret Coders. It's a joint project with a friend of mine named Mike Holmes. I did the writing, he did the art. Secret Coders combines these two worlds that I've been a part of for a very long time, but they've always been separate worlds. So I am a cartoonist. I also have taught high school computer science for years and years and years. And that's what this book is. It's a graphic novel that teaches you the basics of coding, the basics of programming. The way we're pitching it is we're telling people that it's kind of like Harry Potter. These young people find the secret school, but the secret school, instead of teaching magic, teaches coding. You know the problem with Harry Potter, right? You read the book, you get all super excited about it, but then when you try the same things at home, you don't get to become a wizard. We fixed that in our book. When you try the same things at home, you actually become a coder. So this will be out in September from First Second Books. My last book to have come out from them came out just this past July. It's called The Shadow Hero, which Michael mentioned earlier. And I will tell you a little bit more about this book at the end of the presentation. First, I want to tell you about the interface between these two pieces of who I am. Cartoonist, like comic book creator, and Asian American. When I entered into the American comic book industry, I was actually really surprised. I was surprised by the fact that there are so many Asian Americans in the American comic book industry. If you ask any comic book fan for their top 10 creators, most likely there are going to be 1 or 2 or 3 Asian Americans on there. I don't have statistics to back this up, but I think that Asian Americans are probably better represented in American comics than in any other American entertainment medium. So I'm gonna show you a few of my heroes. There's Linda Berry, who's half Filipino, so I'm claiming her. There's Greg Pak, who writes for both Marvel and DC. There's Jay Lee, who draws for both Marvel and DC. Debbie Huey, who does a great book called Bumper Boy. Jason Shiga. There's just a lot of us. A lot. I need to cut some people out of this slide because it takes so long. Okay, a lot. Now, this last dude who came up on the screen, His name is Jim Lee. He made a name for himself in the 90s by drawing X-Men. He's like this fan favorite artist. I used to go line up for Jim Lee's signature at these different comic book conventions, and the lines would literally take like a couple hours. That's how famous he was and popular he was. He eventually founds his own company called Image Comics, and then he sells a piece of his company to DC Comics, the publishers of Superman and Batman. Nowadays, he is a co-publisher at DC Comics, so he's like one of the big cheeses. Because he is both on the creative side and the business side of comics, I think you could argue that Jim Lee is the most powerful man in American comics. A Korean American is the most powerful man in American comics. How did this happen? I mean, parents of Asian American people are asking this all over. How did this happen? Because being in comics is not one of the approved career paths, right? It is not doctor, lawyer, or engineer. This is something that I like to talk about with my comic book friends, usually after a comic book convention, usually over a couple of beers. And I would just like to share with you a few of our drunken theories as to why this might be. So here's drunken theory number one. It comes from the structure of the comics medium. We all know that comics are a combination of words and pictures. They're a single unified experience made up of two distinct media. Now, if you look at traditional European culture, words and pictures were always seen as two separate disciplines. The people who were awesome at words were not the same as the people who were awesome at pictures. There were two separate disciplines, and whenever they combined together, the results were never seen as high art. They were seen as either vulgar, like in the case of advertising, or childish, or immature. Wasn't to be taken seriously. Now, if you look at traditional Asian culture, this is just simply not the case. If you look at traditional Chinese brush painting or Japanese printmaking, almost always the image is paired with words. So anytime you have an image, you have poetry to go along with the image. The work is not considered complete unless both of those elements are there. The work is not considered masterful unless both of those elements are masterful. So maybe, theory number one, maybe Asian Americans are drawn to American comics because something about our cultural heritage prepares us to like this combination of words and pictures. The second theory comes from the origin of the American comic book. Now, the comic book as we think of it today, the format that we think of today was created in America in 1933 by these two printing press employees. They put together a whole bunch of Sunday comic strips, formatted it into a book, and within a decade, this format had become this multinational, worldwide phenomenon. In the early days of American comics, almost all of the greats were these children of Jewish immigrants. So there was Jack Kirby, who was born Jacob Kurtzberg. He's the co-creator of the Hulk and the Avengers and the X-Men. There's Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel, who are the co-creators of Superman. There's Stan Lee, who was born Stanley Lieber, co-created Spider-Man, Avengers, X-Men. Joe Simon co-created Captain America with Jack Kirby. Will Eisner did this incredibly influential strip in the 1940s called The Spirit. He's kind of like the godfather of American comics. Bob Kane, who was born Robert Kahn, is a co-creator of Batman. And Harvey Kurtzman was the founder of Mad Magazine. All children of Jewish immigrants. Now, this immigrantness of their upbringing actually makes its way in early comic book stories. So for instance, Superman, I think you could argue, is kind of Jewish. So think about his origin story. As a baby, he gets put in this metal basket and launched into space to save him from doom. He grows up to become the savior of a people. That is basically Moses, right? Moses, as a baby, is put in this little basket of reeds, launched into a river to save him from doom. He grows up to become the savior of a people. Superman is a strong man who can have all of his power sapped away from him by this one critical weakness. In his case, it is a glowing green rock called kryptonite. This is kind of like Samson, the Hebrew strongman, who also has a critical weakness that saps him of all of his strength. In his case, it's haircuts. So from the very beginning, there's been this Jewishness that has been embedded into American comics. From the very beginning, comics has been an outsider's medium. It's been a way for these kids from these poor Jewish neighborhoods in New York and Cleveland to find a voice for themselves. Maybe Asian Americans are drawn to American comics because of this outside nature of the medium. I talked about how Superman is Jewish. Superman might also be Asian American. Here is my evidence. And this is actually, there's an entire anthology built around this idea called Secret Identities about Asian American superheroes. You should check it out. It's amazing. But here's my evidence as to why Superman might be Asian American. He has black hair. He wears glasses. He's mild-mannered. He has 2 different names. He has an American name, Clark Kent, and this foreign name with a hyphen in it, Kal-El. He wears 2 different sets of clothes, American clothes and these Kryptonian clothes, these foreign clothes. His parents are non-English speaking scientists who send their kid to America for a better life. Superman might be an Asian American Jew. Last theory, last drunken theory between me and my friends comes from current American cultural trends. I am sure you have noticed that we have recently been experiencing this influx of Japanese pop culture into our shores, right? American pop culture is now heavily, heavily influenced by Japanese pop culture, and the book market is certainly no exception. For a really long time, the manga section was the fastest growing section of every bookstore. In fact, if you are a frequenter at your local bookstore or your local library, you have seen these people. These people we call the manga aisle hobos. They just hang out and read manga all day. Now, I talked about how the comic book format was this American invention. It got exported all over the world. And in certain cultures, this idea of the comic book took particular hold. One of those places was in Japan. Now, even though this idea of a comic book came from America, pretty quickly these 2 cultures separated with very little contact until recently. So both America and Japan grew their own ways of telling stories through comics. In America, the most popular format for years and years and years was this pamphlet format, 22 pages, saddle-stitched. And in Japan, they developed this format that looked more like a novel. The pages were black and white. The volumes were much thicker. They were square-bound. Series would often run for volumes and volumes and volumes with thousands of pages. Each of these cultures also developed their own unique visual artifacts for conveying story, for conveying emotion. Here's just one example. Those of you who are manga fans will be familiar with this. You see that little plus sign on this character's head? You know what that means? What does that mean? What does that mean?
He's either really frustrated,
That's right.
or he's a really weird mood.
So she's super frustrated, right? That little plus sign is a representation of a vein that pops in a character's head when she or he is super, super frustrated. Very common in Japanese comics. Up until very recently, it was virtually unheard of in American comics. In Japanese comics, this sort of visual artifact was so common, in fact, that eventually lost its representational value. So in comics and in cartoons, you'll see it used like this, where it is pure symbol. Pure symbol. Well, because we've been seeing this huge influx of Japanese pop culture into our shores, modern American readers actually expect a blend of both Japanese and American storytelling styles. They expect this blend of East and West. A lot of Asian American creators, like my friend Derek Kirk Kim, so he's a different person from me. I know we kind of look alike because he stole my style, but he's a different person from me. But a lot of us grew up reading both American and Japanese comics, even before Japanese comics went through this huge surge of popularity. So for a lot of us, our native storytelling style is this blend of East and West that modern American audiences have come to expect. Unfortunately for our parents, I think this trend is just going to continue. As the decades roll on, I think more and more Asian Americans are going to enter into American comics to find a voice for themselves there. So I'm going to end by telling you a little bit more about The Shadow Hero, which is my most recent graphic novel to have come out. The Shadow Hero, the main character of The Shadow Hero is this guy called the Green Turtle, who is not my invention. He actually is the creation of a Chinese-American cartoonist by the name of Chu Hing. Chu Hing worked in the American comic book industry in the 1940s and 50s. He's pretty obscure. Most comic book fans have not heard of him. Now, I first learned about Chu Hing through a blog called Pappy's Golden Age Blogzine. It's still going around, and what this blog does is it highlights obscure characters from the golden age of comics, from the 40s and 50s. One day, in one entry, he talks about the Green Turtle, who is this character who is rumored to be the very first Asian American superhero. Supposedly, Chu, his creator, was asked by his publisher to create a superhero, to latch on to the superhero craze that was going on at the time. So he creates the Green Turtle, who is not a very good character. He's kind of a Batman ripoff. He works out of a cave. He drives this turtle-shaped airplane. His costume is pretty terrible. He has a cowl, a cape, boots, like little Speedo pants, gloves, and that's it. No shirt, no pants. Kind of crazy. But the reason why the Green Turtle captured my imagination is that supposedly Chu Hing wanted him to be a Chinese American like he himself was, but his publishers wouldn't let him do it. They didn't think that a Chinese American hero would sell. So Chu Hing reacts very passive aggressively. He draws these early Green Turtle comics so that the panels always look like this. The character almost always has his back turned towards you, so all you see is his cape. And then when he is turned around, something is blocking his face, like either a shadow or another character's head or his own arm. And supposedly the reason why Chu Hing did this was so that he and his reader could imagine his character as he originally intended, as a Chinese American. I don't know if those rumors are true. I've talked to collectors of Golden Age comics. Nobody knows. There's this guy named Alex J, who is a logo designer. He's a legendary logo designer. If you read comics in the 80s and 90s, you most likely read a comic that had a logo designed by Alex J. He is also an amateur. He's an amateur researcher. So he was able to find all this information about Chu Hing. He didn't have any kids. He only has a nephew that is surviving. We don't really know. We have no idea if he actually meant this. But I thought it was intriguing enough that I wanted to do a story about him. Green Turtle, believe it or not, is not very popular. He only lasted 5 issues in a series called Blazing Comics. And it was over before Chu ever got around to telling us his origin story. So we don't know what his real secret identity is. We don't know for sure if he's actually an Asian American. I saw a hole there that I could fill. So I asked a friend of mine named Sunny Liu, amazingly talented cartoonist based out of Singapore, to work with me on this graphic novel, The Shadow Hero, where we basically provide an origin story for this obscure character from the 1940s. Luckily for us, the copyright laws in the 1940s were very different, so he's in public domain now, so we were able to do this. I was even able to find a copy of Blazing Comics #1, the very first appearance of the Green Turtle, in a bin at a Comic-Con. I paid $70 for it, and then I disassembled it so that I could scan each page and include it in our volume. So you get to see original Green Turtle stories in our volume. Well, thank you. Thank you again for coming. Michael and I are going to sit down now. We're going to have a short conversation.
Gene, it's so great to have you here. Again, we're lucky to have him here. You know, you and I, as kids, two of the uncoolest things you could do would be into coding and be into comics.
That's right.
You know,
That's right.
and even I'm originally from San Francisco. Gene lives in the Bay Area. Even there, it was just, and you might as well wear a Dungeons and Dragons shirt and walk around with your lightsaber in the middle school halls. I mean,
Yeah.
that was about. And now they're both as cool as you can get because the Jim Lees and the Bill Gateses have been running the world.
Yeah,
Can
I
you
think
talk
it's kind of
about that?
I think it's kind of a crazy thing. I think if you had told me when I was in high school that pretty much everybody in America would know who Rocket Raccoon was, I would have been like, come on, be real. I think it's shocking that you have quote unquote cool kids who are actually good at sports,
Yeah.
wearing Avengers t-shirts now.
Right,
You
yeah.
know, it's so weird. I
Yeah.
think it's a weird thing.
It's like the whole planet has turned
Yes.
upside down.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I'm curious because growing up, like, I think of 3 of my best friends in particular who were from first or second generation from Korea, China, and Japan. The parents, it was very strong. You're going to become, if you failed as a doctor, you're going to become an engineer. If you failed as an engineer, you can become a lawyer. And there wasn't much choice. I mean, that's what they pretty much all went into. And we all sat around reading comics. How did you escape that? What metal basket did you find in the reeds to get your way into comics as well as coding?
So my parents are both immigrants. My dad was born in Taiwan. My mom in mainland China. My mom has always had artistic inclinations, even though she was never formally trained. So she has always secretly been supportive.
Yeah.
You know, her rule was, as long as I had health insurance, just go. My dad was much more of a typical immigrant parent. You know, a lot of times immigrant parents, they worked so hard to get to this country and to make it in a country that doesn't speak their native tongue. He got an engineering degree in English. I think that's shocking.
Yeah.
Like if you had asked me to do the same thing in Mandarin, I would just starve. I would end up panhandling. So he doesn't want me to screw it up. He doesn't want me to screw it up. Right before, all the way through growing up, we had this constant fight. I was interested in comics and arts in general, and he wanted me to be doctor, lawyer, engineer. Finally, right before I went to college, he sat me down and he said, just major in something practical. Major in something practical, and if you do that, I will leave you alone. You can do whatever you want after you graduate. You can become a garbage man, and I won't say anything. So I did. I majored in computer science. I also am interested in computer science myself, but I definitely, part of the reason for my choice was my dad. And after I graduated from college, I took a job as a software engineer for 2 years. During those 2 years, my dad didn't say a word. Then I quit my software development job. I took on a job as a high school computer science teacher. I also started making comics at around the same time. My dad didn't say anything. But every couple of months, I'd get an envelope from him in my mailbox, and I'd open it up. There wouldn't be a letter or anything. It'd just be newspaper clippings, and it'd be like, want ads from Apple or Microsoft.
Your dad was subtle.
Yeah,
You're saying.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Or it would be like these articles that would compare teacher salaries to programmer salaries, and eventually that finally stopped. Right after American Born Chinese was published. After American Born Chinese was published.
And that was about 2003?
That was 2006.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it.
So about a couple months after it was published,
Okay.
a Chinese language newspaper for overseas Chinese called the World Journal
Mm-hmm.
did a feature on me in their living section. So I went to visit my dad, and he had actually clipped out that article and laminated it, and I never got an envelope after that.
Wow.
Ever again.
Yes. And you still have health insurance, right?
I do have health insurance. You know, now that I'm an adult,
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of wisdom in that.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of wisdom in making sure you always have health insurance.
Yeah. Now, how many children do you have now?
We have four. We
Four
have
children.
kids.
Cartoonists supporting 4 children. That is a rare thing in this country. But do you encourage them in any way? Are they, if they all want to grow up and become cartoonists, or you go for it? Or,
Okay, I'll
or
be
have you
honest.
put them all to work inking for you?
I'll be honest here. Now that I've gotten an up close look at what comics are like, what the book industry is like, what just creative life is like, there are definitely hard pieces to it. You know what I mean? It is not an easy thing.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of uncertainty there. You are trading certainty for artistic freedom. That's
Yeah.
basically the trade-off.
Yeah.
So my oldest, they're all kind of artistic now, but my oldest, when he was 2, he started drawing, and he would draw these really elaborate pictures of cars and of these scenes with machines and robots in them. And when I saw it, I was like, oh no. Oh no. So I started talking to him. I started being like, people who work for Toyota also draw cars. So I just think now that I'm older, I think even though me and my dad butted our heads a lot, there's a wisdom to what he wanted.
Yeah.
That I think you have to respect. Like I think for a lot of us, what we need to do is we need to balance pursuing our dreams with this wisdom from our parents.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, to talk about Shadow Hero a little more, we had talked about this. I mean, this has got to be gratifying because this isn't, we can talk about it in a little while. You are writing Superman next month. We said a little more than a year ago he had never written a superhero story. You write Shadow Hero, and now they say, here is your Asian American Jewish Superman that you can now write. It is you. He is in your hands. You hold that metal basket. But can you talk a little bit about, as you have brought Shadow Hero to the world, what is most gratifying about that?
Well, Shadow Hero is my first superhero comic book. I grew up a superhero fan. I don't know what took me so long to get onto superheroes. I don't know why. I'd been doing comics for 7-8 years before I got into a superhero comic, before I decided to do a superhero story. I think maybe some of it was when I first got into the industry, I had all of these pretensions about, like I don't think this exists as much anymore. But in the 90s, there was definitely this divide between quote unquote mainstream comics, which are superhero comics, and quote unquote independent comics, which are considered more artistic.
You were Mouse or Mickey Mouse, one or the other.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
One or the other. One or the other. But now I think the lines are bleeding a little bit, and there are people who use conventions in one to tell stories in the other.
Yeah.
And I think that's awesome. I think some of the greatest stories combine both quote unquote high art and quote unquote low art conventions.
Yeah.
So I did the Shadow Hero when I read about Chu Hing and the Green Turtle online. I knew I wanted to do something about it. I also knew I didn't have the drawing chops to do it. So roping Sonny Liu into the project was a coup for
Yeah,
me. He's just phenomenally talented.
Yeah.
He's also working for DC actually. I just found out that he actually signed to do Dr. Fate,
Yeah,
which is one of my
nice.
favorite superheroes when I was growing up for DC. He's doing it with a writer named Paul Levitz.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's been
Okay.
fun. It's been phenomenal.
Yeah, well, and that ties to the issue of diversity. I'll repeat it again. I'm from the Washington Post. I write the blog Comic Riffs, and for next weekend in the Washington Post magazine, you can look for my cover story on a local. It's a children's series, YA Dork Diaries. But it's a local family because I was here 1 year ago and I saw Raina Telgemeyer's amazing line, if you know Smile Drama Sisters. And next to it was Dork Diaries, and this line of 300 people snaked all the way around this tent. And what I realized is that they are telling stories. They are telling that it's a family of they're all African American, and they're trying to tell diverse stories. And we're seeing this. It seems to have momentum now. It seems to be. And you gave an amazing speech at the National Book Festival last year about we need diverse books. Can you talk a little bit about what that means to you and giving your permission to write characters of different cultures?
Yeah, I could talk a little bit about the speech.
Sure.
Last year, at the end of last year, I was given the opportunity to give a short 5 to 10 minute speech at the National Book Festival about anything I wanted. And fresh on my mind when I found that out was a residency that I did in Minnesota. I'm part of a teaching faculty at Hamline University. I'm part of their low-res program for their MFA in writing for children and young adults. So what that means is every semester I will work with 1 to 3 students online. They'll submit writing to me. I'll give them back notes. And then once a year, I'll fly out to Hamline and spend about a week and a half with other faculty and students. So we did this residency that summer, which was all about diversity. We brought these amazing speakers in to talk about it. And one of the themes that came out of the talks that we gave was you ought to be a little bit hesitant.
Yeah.
When you are writing characters that are not like you don't just want to just go in with guns a-blazing. You need to do your homework. You need to do your research. And you need to have that hesitancy and humility before you do that.
Yeah.
As a way of respecting this culture that you're writing about. What a lot of my students took away from it was I will never write a character that is different from me because they just ended up getting super freaked out about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when I saw the fear in their eyes, I recognized that fear inside of me.
Yeah.
I have felt that before. None of us, especially if we take issues of diversity, if we take culture seriously, none of us want to mess up, especially in somebody else's culture, right? So that speech, I just talked about that fear, how as writers, first of all, we have to give ourselves permission to make mistakes in our first draft, and that includes cultural mistakes. If you never make those mistakes, you'll never be able to correct them. And second is we can't write from a place of fear. I think I'm constantly writing from a place of fear, and I can see it in my first drafts.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that
How do you get that fear out of your first drafts? How do you kind of
when it comes to issues of culture, I think having somebody who is actually an insider to that culture read your first draft is definitely helpful.
Yeah.
I think books that come out of that culture natively are also really helpful.
Yeah.
And I also think that there's a certain part of writing where you just have to accept that fear. That's just going to be a part of your writing life.
Yeah.
And you just have to learn to live with it and deal with it.
Absolutely. And I do want to say Gene rocked that speech. I mean, this was serious. You can go. I put within a couple days. I put the text. Was fortunate enough to get the text of that speech, put it up. So if you Google Gene Luen Yang and Comic Riffs. Read this. That speech will come up. It's worth reading because it's powerful. It relates to so many elements of comics. I will also say in that room, there were many novelists, many people. Their nose was a little bit in the air. And it's still with comics, we face still a certain prejudice. We have a complex, I think, as cartoonists. And by the end of that, they were standing, applauding. Gene had won them over. So that was a tough room at the Library of Congress, and Gene killed. What that relates to is you also, as an educator, teacher, comics maker, you understand and have studied a lot about the brain. And I've talked at length with Linda Berry. You mentioned her work. Linda Berry, Ernie Pook's comique, she now teaches a class, I believe it's in Madison, University of Wisconsin, and it's about comics and how it activates the brain. And I wrote a long piece. You can go to it. Gene is included in that prominently. If you go to wapo.st/graphic novels in schools, it's because a teacher told my daughter that a graphic novel isn't a book. And I took that as a mission, that you can do the best, you can learn more from a graphic novel. But what we talked about is that comics fire more active areas of the brain than just reading text. And, I'm partial as a visual artist to believing that's a valuable way to learn. Can you talk about the power of graphic images? There's bias here, but what it does and how you learn.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say that word-only books are awesome. I'm a huge fan of word-only books, and I would be so sad if word-only books were replaced with graphic novels. But at the same time, I think both these formats have a place at the table, and graphic novels and comic books have been denied this place for decades for not really good reasons. One of the reasons I like comics so much as an educator and as a cartoonist is the way in which these two distinct media, words and pictures, kind of interact with each other on the page. I really think that comics, in a way, fit the way we communicate in the modern world. So all of us are used to interacting with multimedia pages, right? We're used to seeing pages that have text and pictures and sound bites and video clips all next to each other, all in a single unified experience. Yeah. So for comics in the classroom, when we teach our kids, when we teach our students to read comics, and especially when we teach them to make comics, we are teaching them to think in that multimedia way. Because when a kid needs to make a comic, what they have to do is for each piece of information they want to convey, they have to decide if that information is better conveyed through the picture or through the text. They're making deep decisions on communication based on strengths and weaknesses of media. Comics becomes this wonderful training ground for communication in this new century.
Yeah, and can you talk about you've got Secret Decoders, you've got Superman. What sort of guides you? I mean, there's a through line to much of your work, and yet, on the other hand, it's all over the place. I was talking with someone about how the same director who directed Happy Feet also directed Mad Max Fury Road.
Wow.
What kind of mind does that take? Not that you're quite there, but you are so open to going in different directions. What do you look for when deciding on a new project?
I think there are certain themes that I'm always drawn to, themes of identity and culture. But at the same time, teaching has this way of forcing you to live up to what you say. So one of the things that I say to my students through Hamlin is I say, like whenever they come up to me and they say, should I do this project, or this project? I always say, which one's the scariest for you? Do that one. So that's what I try to do. I come up with multiple ideas, and then I try to pursue the scariest one.
Yeah.
The next project that I'm working on that I am writing and drawing will be a nonfiction piece about a high school basketball team that I followed this past season.
Yeah.
And I'm not a huge basketball fan.
Yeah.
I was
you
actually
giving yourself permission to write about that culture?
I was actually I was actually really like the basketball team is made up of African American. Most of the players are African American. There are 2 Asian American players and 1 white player.
Yeah.
So that mix of characters I've never written before,
Yeah.
right? And I'm sucky at sports. I was never good at sports.
Yeah.
I've never actually sat in a locker room like that before. So I'm actually really freaked out about it. But at the same time, that's the advice that I give my
When
students.
you
so I
face
gotta
your
do
fear,
the same
you
thing.
face your fear.
Yeah, I try to.
Yeah.
We'll see. I mean, this could be a terrible, terrible book. We'll see how it goes.
You could relive middle school horrors of the locker room.
Yeah.
That gets at too. Some cartoonists, I know some print cartoonists, when young people, we have a lot of young people here, when they come up for advice, often they will, like one prominent cartoonist I know, comic strip creator, and a little, parent will bring their child up and they'll say, hey, Draws, what do you recommend? And this cartoonist will say, go work for Pixar. Meaning, don't be tied. My career has been as a cartoonist, journalist, tied to newspapers. And he's saying, like, don't yoke yourself to that. You must get that with students. But now we see, book publishing exploding in certain ways online. That doesn't mean you can necessarily translate that into buying your own health insurance in the online world. We see so much more. We're a visual world. We're exposed to so much more visually. I've talked to people who cover online culture say we now see more images in a day than 20 years ago we might see in a month. But what kind of advice do you give to young artists, graphic storytellers who want to work visually about this?
Yeah, I think it's hard to give advice to young folks because we are not totally sure what the world's going to be like in 10 years, in 5 years, right? We don't know. Things are changing so quickly. So I think it's more about having a specific mentality than it is about having like a very clear career trajectory. We just don't. The clear career trajectory is a thing of the past. That's just not something we can rely on anymore. What I tell young people is, if you want to pursue art, don't just pursue art. Because often your art is going to come out of your life, and you have to live a kind of interesting life. I know some artists will disagree with me on this, but for artists who just have art in their lives and nothing else, their art ends up being like these mirrors that are reflecting each other endlessly. And I think it's kind of interesting for a moment, but there's nothing really deep there.
Yeah.
So what Neil Gaiman says, and it's always good to steal from Neil Gaiman, is he says that you can develop all of the writing skill you want, but at some point you just got to go live life. Otherwise, you will never have anything interesting to say.
Yeah, and so many of his are ghost stories, so I don't know where he's going at that time. A dark other worlds, but no, it is so true. Otherwise, even your parents stop caring about what you're writing and drawing.
Yeah,
it gets
right.
so insular. Well, one of the greatest fears, even for an excellent public speaker like Gene, is taking questions cold from the audience. That's because we don't know what's coming. We have about 5 minutes, so would anyone like to just? Yes, please. Here, you got a microphone.
Oh, okay. Do you have like any advice? Cause like, I like to draw, but
You want to be a cartoonist?
everything looks like the opposite of what I meant it to look like. If I draw like an apple, it looks like a meatball. And when I draw
I
a
have
person,
the
it looks
same
like a
thing
dead
happen.
person.
My apples are like meatballs too. It's ridiculous.
He has a meatball computer.
It's
actually.
horrible. So, so I don't know if
Sorry.
I don't know. One of the super practical tips I got, and I don't even remember who I got this from, is that. Do you ever have this thing where you draw something and you think it looks awesome, but then you come to it the next day or like 5 days later, then you realize it's actually not so awesome. It's actually terrible. One thing you could do is after you finish drawing something, you look at the mirror image of it. You either hold it up to the sunlight or you hold it up to a mirror, and I think you can better see what it looks like to other people besides the drawer. Wow. So if you do that, you will allow yourself to fix some of those mistakes. You'll allow yourself to take some of that meatballness out of your apple.
That's a direct question. Now you tell me. I've been got a whole career. Yes. Anyone? Oh, yes.
Hi. Oh, excuse me. This is just a comment. Gene, I'd like to thank you in person and congratulate you for having Shadow Hero on the Black Eyed Susan Book Award for Maryland for next year.
Thank you so much for that honor. It's amazing. Thank you.
And we have
Coming
over
around.
here.
Nope.
Yes, please.
So many of your books are about coming of age stories. Have you ever thought about writing about different stages of life, about a software developer, anything like that?
So the question is, how have I thought about writing? In comics, comics until recently, at least, hasn't had this like tight age demographics thing. If you go to your local comic book store, they might have a kids section, they might have an adult section, but the vast majority of comics are in this middle ground. Whereas if you go to your local bookstore, things are very tightly categorized by age. So I didn't set out to write YA. I just set out to do comics. And after I got picked up by my current publisher, For Second, that's when I got categorized as YA. I do think that kind of fits me, though. I feel like I naturally gravitate towards that age group. I don't know if it's just the fact that I taught high school for so many years. But it is scary to think about writing outside of that age group. So I've got to do it at some point, right? I've got to do it.
Yes.
In American-born Chinese, the cousin who comes to visit seems to personify all the horrible stereotypes. Did you get any flack for that after the book came out?
Okay, so you're talking about the cousin Chinky character in American-born Chinese, who is the amalgamation of all of the negative Asian, Chinese, and Chinese-American stereotypes that I could think of. I did get flack for that. I did get flack. I'll tell you this. I have generally had 3 different reactions to that character. Number one, some people, usually Asian Americans who are a little bit older, in their 50s and 60s, will come up to me and they'll say, as soon as I saw that character in your book, it brought up so much pain that I couldn't read your book anymore, or it was really hard for me to power through it. And I kind of think that's good, because that's what I was going through for. I wanted that discomfort. I have other people who say, Cousin Chinky was hilarious, but I felt weird about laughing. I was laughing with a knot in my stomach, and that's kind of awesome too. I think racism sometimes can actually be funny. But we have to
repeat.
Be yeah, racism can be,
If
but
you're live tweeting GBF15, racism
is
can be funny.
But I do think that racism can be funny for really different reasons. I think, one, racism can be funny because the ideas themselves are ridiculous. Or we can find racism funny because we're worried that the racist ideas themselves might be true. So I definitely think that I was trying to go for the first kind of humor with Cousin Chinky than the second, and that's the last reaction that I get that makes me super uncomfortable. Sometimes people interpret it in that last way, and it just kind of freaks me out a little bit.
And I will say, with the Shadow Hero, one of my favorite touches is that you have the hero. This is the first, maybe in the history of comic books, the first superhero whose mom drives him to his missions. It's brilliant. It's one of my favorite. My good friend, we had a Chinese mother, drove us everywhere. So if we'd been even in spandex, there he is, mom saying, "Here you go." Yes.
I wanted to ask about. I stepped out when you started talking about diversity, so sorry. So if this was covered, my bad. But if not, one of the things that you talked about in the last panel, I think you talked about it earlier too, is that how you gravitated towards superheroes because of the outsider status of superheroes, the fact that they came from a lot of Jewish immigrants. There's also a strain of thought in a lot of online commentary that superheroes epitomize whiteness. Michelle Rodriguez said this a few months ago, "Stop stealing white people's superheroes." Noah Berlatsky's website, Hooded Utilitarian, constantly talks about how superheroes are whiteness personified. What's your reaction? Because I'm with you. I think that the superheroes do speak to people who are of color because of that outsider nature. But what do you say to the people who think that superhero by default equates whiteness?
Yeah, I think every story, every time you put out a story, it's the meaning of that story is a collaboration between the creator and the reader. And for that particular issue, I am very biased. The fact that I grew up reading superheroes, the fact that I kind of began loving superheroes in this pre-logical way at a very young age makes me biased to be sympathetic to superheroes. So my answer to that is I think superheroes have been used as these representations of the dominant culture, but there is this underlying thread that runs through every superhero story about how they are not accepted by society.
Yeah. Plus, as you got at in his Library of Congress speech last year at the National Book Festival, there is this duality. You talked about Dwayne McDuffie, this great African-American creator who was very frustrated. When he worked for Marvel 25 years ago, he actually wrote a memo. Hey, he was mocking their approach to superheroes. Said, here's your hip new black superhero. And it had him saying jiggy-witted on his skateboard as he's rapping and wearing, Public Enemy thing. And it was every stereotype. It was a point to bust down stereotypes. But as you said, him reading Black Panther. You said, oh, here you have Stan Lee using the word black in it. So the marketing is so shallow, but it motivated him to go into the field.
Yeah.
And so you have this duality. I wrote a piece the other day about how I think superhero movies are going to save Hollywood in terms of diversity because comic readers get it. And because they sell so well, I think that's where you're going to see in the next 5 years a huge shift, I believe. I think we have time for one more question.
I had actually one quick question.
Yeah.
I wanted to know, I love Shadow Hero. That was a
Thank
very multi-layered story, but I want to know one thing. Do you need to lose a parent to be a superhero?
If you're going to do it for Disney, anything owned by Disney.
That's right. That's right.
Not just Disney.
Yeah, yeah. That seems like a trope that I wanted to play with. Yeah, that was definitely a trope I wanted to play with in that book.
Yeah. Do we have time
Thank
for
you.
one more?
Maybe one quick one.
I see one there.
So you said kind of in passing that you felt like you had a drawing limitation, that you wouldn't have been able to draw the Shadow Hero. And can you just talk a little bit about, the drawing limitations that you run into in your own books, and what was it particularly about that story where you wanted to have somebody else draw it that had a different style?
I have a very limited drawing ability. That's what I've realized. Like, I used to think I was awesome. When I was in high school, I thought I was the best. But then I started hanging out with other cartoonists, and I realized I'm like average at best.
Your meatballs rock, though.
Yeah. Thanks. So for the Shadow Hero specifically, I just didn't think I could pull off like a mix of humor and drama and action, especially the action piece. I think I was just a little bit weak on.
Yeah.
So and Sonny Liu is just amazing.
He kills. He crushes.
He's awesome.
Well, my interview with Gene posted on the Washington Post blog, Comic Riffs, yesterday. Gene is just as eloquent in print as in person. Both Gene, I'm far more eloquent in print, so don't judge me by today. But let's please give a huge welcome to Gene, Lou, and Yang.
Thank you so much.